Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. I hope you guys enjoyed lunch because I ran down a hallway to get here as quickly as possible. But good afternoon. My name is Tiye McKethen, and I am the project manager at Identity Theft Resource Center. I am here with Dr. Glenance Green and James Lee. Dr. Glenance Green is the co-founder and executive director of Black Researchers Collective, and James Lee is ITRC's COO and my boss. So that's pretty exciting. Let's go to the next slide. In late 2021, the Identity Theft Resource Center found there to be a lack of actionable data and custom programs available for communities of color and, in general, disadvantaged communities. And we learned through that short amount of time that we had an overwhelming amount of individuals compared to the Black census data. So 13% of US Census data says that there are 13% of the makeup is Black Americans. We had 17% of individuals that contacted us in 2021 identify as African American or Black. So we automatically saw that we were having a disproportionate amount of individuals contact us, and that obviously raised some questions. So in 2021, we decided to start a program called Umpire, was its original name, which was the use, maintenance, protection, and recovery of identity theft. And then through time, we kind of specialized that name to be called Identity in Practice, because there was an understanding that identity, digital identity, all of the microcosms of this larger ecosystem is about how users or citizens or individuals in specific communities actually practice those elements. So between the last year, my first question in March was, why do cultural communities matter in the concept of identity theft and just identity in general, which led to why are these communities overrepresented when it's the question of theft and loss. And the question I want to ask today, really towards James and Glenance here, is how do we protect Black communities and other communities of color in the changing identity landscape? I know through the conversations that we've all gone to in the past 2 days, there's a lot about growth and future and how we protect those futures and how we catch up with those futures. But I don't think it's wrong of me to say that I want to know how we're protecting people who are already disadvantaged in every other aspect. So again, I'm so thankful to be joined by James and Dr. Green today. So James, my first question to you though is, why was it important for ITRC to conduct this research?
Well, I think you talked about the history of it, where we had over time, not just in 2021, but we had been noticing over time this gap between the number of people of color who were contacting us compared to the general population. So for those of you who don't know who the ITRC is, we are a 23-year-old organization. We're a nonprofit. Our primary mission is to provide free victim assistance to victims of identity crimes. So going back to 1999, when that started, we were talking about pieces of paper and things left on people's desks or dumped in dumpsters was how identity crimes were committed. Now, fast forward to where we are today, and we all here know that it is the compromise of identities, largely because of data breaches, which fuel identity fraud and various scams. So we started to see this steady rise of people of color coming to us requesting assistance, but that gap growing and growing compared to the population. We didn't really know why that was happening, and we thought that it was important to learn that, because it is our mission to then, once we know something why, is to do something about that. And to do something about that part is to develop specific programs that are going to be culturally competent, so match it to the culture of that community to be able to be more helpful in the times when identities are compromised. We also didn't really know how it was occurring and what the unique impacts, because one of the things we have learned over time is every victim is unique. Every victimization is unique. There may be common threads, but it is unique to the individual, and we needed to understand what was occurring and why before we could come forward to have something other than just a generic advice to people in the African American and Black community.
Yeah. BRC, when you guys jumped in, you jumped in without like a full breadth of knowledge of identity theft or just the identity atmosphere in general. What do you feel like you learned as an individual, like you, Glenance, and what do you feel like BRC as the kind of institution you guys are building yourselves up to be learned through this experience as well?
Yeah, I think as an individual, the biggest thing that I learned is that I too was a victim of identity theft and identity crime by someone in my family. And I think just because of the nature and structure of our families, particularly in the Black community, I didn't think of it as that. And so that's also something that we found to be true of other families that were also victims of identity crimes as well in this study. So I think I also learned a lot how important these safeguards are, preventative measures. Identity crime and theft is not something you think about until it happens to you often, but how necessary it is to be thinking about it, you know, on the front end so that you could be able to put in the proper safeguards to protect yourself. So I would say as an individual. As an organization, you know, I think that what I learned as an individual extends to the community. How we talked to so many folks who didn't know that they were victims of an identity crime. And when we talked about the definition and unpacked it according to the ITRC, they're like, oh yeah, well this thing happened to me. They can go over a laundry list of things that happened to them. And they were repeat victims as well. And so that was something that was really big. But once they became a victim, how they're able to access supports and services for remediation and recovery, that was something that folks felt was really inaccessible. And so it was tremendously overwhelming, mentally stressful. It caused a lot of distress in their personal lives. They felt like it was a personal violation. And so I think that those were the kinds of things that ended up being extended to the community. And so as a result, as an organization, as we continue to build and become a content expert in this work as well, through this work, it's incumbent upon us to think about, all right, we have direct access to our communities. How then can we make these findings much more accessible so that people can, you know, be privy to this information so that they can think about what safeguards are best for them and start implementing those things as soon as possible. I know since I've been involved with this work, I told you some of my practices have shifted big time in terms of how I protect my own identity.
Yeah. So in our quantitative survey that was conducted in September of 2022, we learned a lot that, I mean, personally was a little bit depressing coming from, I grew up in 3rd Ward, Houston, which is an all-Black community. It's gentrifying now. It's vastly different than when I grew up in, but this is reflective of the community I grew up in. So of our survey respondents, the average survey respondent made less than $75,000 a year, and over 52% reside in households without any children under the age of 18. To specify why that is important, multi-generational families are incredibly important in communities of color. It shifts the way that we interact with others outside of our communities, outside of our familial bonds as well. And the average respondent had graduated high school and sought further education. A 2021 Pew report says that Black households are encumbered by a larger debt-to-asset ratios compared to white non-Hispanic households. And one cause of higher ratios is due to a lower probability of having housing debt, considered a tangible asset that can be considered in financial wealth. This is important because 55% of ITRC victims in the 2022 Consumer Impact Report stated that they had problems covering the cost of the need. And according to Pew Research, 36% of Black adults say they only have a 3-month emergency fund, and 43% of lower income adults make just enough to cover basic needs. So when we look at the landscape of being able to even get yourself out of it, it's a much bigger concept than just the loss of money on the onset. It affects so many different things. So
can I stop you for just 1 second?
Yeah.
I want to explain to folks. One of those statistics that Tiye just talked about was our Consumer Impact Report. So we published that report going all the way back to the early 2000s. And that is information based on the victims who contact us. So what is unique to their victimization? And we compile that and publish that in a report. We call that consumer impact. So it's a little bit of it's financial, and we're going to talk about more about the other impacts here in a second. But it is also the emotional impacts, the physical health impacts, the other kind of intangible impacts of identity crimes that we don't think of ordinarily, yet people who are victims, it is the process they go through. It is, and I'm not equating an identity crime with a violent crime, but the process that a victim goes through, absent the physical harm, is identical. So all of the emotional, all of the stresses that come with a violent crime and identity crime victims goes through that very same process. And that report is where we reflect every year how it has changed over the previous year. So, sorry.
yeah, no, that's great. And it kind of segues into my next question for you, which is that you've had a direct impact on national and state policy, and writing it, shaping it on different scales. Why is it important for the average survey respondent's story to be involved in policy shaping?
Yeah, it's a very simple question with a very complex answer. That we in this room, we know what identity is, we know how it's created, we know how it's managed, we know how it can be misused, and we also know how it's used for the benefit of the good. Most people don't know that. And particularly when you're talking about the people who are making public policy, they don't understand the impacts that a violation of someone's identity can have. And particularly when you're talking about historically and systemically underrepresented and communities and people in those communities who have not had the advantages that the majority does, it becomes even more important because policymakers have that ability to do things that can be helpful. And they are relatively simple fixes from a policy perspective, in a more normal time perhaps. But the things that we take for granted when you're doing something as basic as proving you are who you say you are, and what the value of that is becomes all the more important when you are in a community where that is difficult to do on a good day. And then when you layer on an identity crime on top of that, it becomes even more important but also more difficult because of all the other follow-on effects that can be happening. You could be confused in a law enforcement setting. You can be denied basic benefits. You can be denied the things that you need to support your family. So it's vitally important that public policymakers understand that, and the way that we can get them to understand is stories, cataloging the statistics. But what we always talk about at the ITRC is behind every one of those statistics is a person. There is a story behind that, and that's how we get people's attention on how we can improve these things. Because for everything else we're doing at this conference, as wonderful as all these products and these innovations are, when they fail, and they will fail at one time or another, when they fail, the people who are impacted by that wind up at the ITRC seeking help.
Yeah.
So it's important that we make sure people understand what it is happens to people when their identities are compromised and what we can do to help prevent it and recover from it when it does happen.
I joined a session earlier, and I cannot remember whose session it was specifically, but he talked about ethics versus human-centered design. And I kind of want to segue that to, I talk to you in our meetings all the time about values-based and needs-based in research and programming. And despite, it leads to stories very well, despite the convergence of several studies on the analysis of stories, there's little examination on how stories are social processes extending beyond the immediate social encounter. In Black communities, oration, we know, is an incredibly powerful tool. It's how we base, a lot of our cultural values. But as a researcher with a great understanding of cultural impact on research, what led to the focus groups that we had this year being in person, and how would virtual focus groups have affected qualitative data?
Yeah, there are a lot of benefits to both virtual versus in person. I think anytime you have the opportunity to do focus groups in person, you should. I think for the kind of, and somebody could debate me out here in the world, it's cool, it is what it is. But like for the kind of work that we're doing, there's already been a violation, right? You spoke to that, eloquently. People feel like, I don't know if I can trust this person. We had so many people when we showed up to these sessions who said, because we weren't just doing it in Chicago, we were doing it in Philadelphia and Atlanta as well. And so we wanted to make sure that it was really important to have a stakeholder on the ground who people knew of, who they trusted. Because they're like, we Googled you. We wanted to make sure that you were a real person and not a bot or like somebody creating another issue for us, right? And that I was going to be impacted by another crime. And so trust is a big thing. Especially in Black communities, if I don't see you or know you or trust you or have any kind of relationship with you, I'm less likely to give vulnerable and sensitive information to you. Now, if you get it, by hook or crook, you finesse me a little bit, then maybe you'll probably get some information. But if my eyes are wide open and I see what's coming, I'm likely to be much more cautious about what's happening. And I'm not going to tell the whole truth and tell you all of my business. Yeah. We're on screens, people can turn off their videos. In a enclosed space, it's us. Right? And I can say what happens in this room stays in this room. There's no cameras. So much is out of your control when it's virtual because you don't know what spaces that other people are in. If somebody's pouring out their heart to you, you don't know if you're being recorded or captured. So part of that, all of those things were factors that went into the decision to have those in person, knowing that if people are already coming to this space very vulnerable, we wanted them to take that very seriously. We want them to know that we take them very seriously in their stories and hold a space for them to be able to speak openly and candidly in a space that was in solidarity with one another. And we had people breaking down in the sessions, and I don't know if we would have had the same types of emotional responses, with a screen. Yeah. It's not to say it can't happen, because high quality, qualitative data can happen virtually, but in the ways in which we were able to engage with folks, I think it just would have showed up a little differently.
Yeah, I think when I've joined into some of these sessions today and yesterday even, there's a lot of the conversation about like digital identity and the ease of adapting that for a lot of people. But even in this space of like not conducting virtual focus groups, there's also the fact that the adaptation of these things is really based off of your access that you have now, and it's also based off of your trust in whatever is coming to your space. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the group called Bank On, but they really focus on trying to get individuals in underserved communities who may have been redlined by banks. So that's essentially when you've messed with the bank too many times. Getting them back into banking and letting them be able to be part of these services again, which is really important when we go back to just like resolution of these issues.
Can I just say one more thing about that? The knowing your audience piece is really, really big. If you don't care about your audience, it's a different story. But to know your audience, you kind of have to align your strategies to the culture in the context in which your audience is living. So who's familiar with Steve Harvey? Yeah, show of hands. Yes, good. Everything. Are you there? Okay, cool. Show of hands if folks are familiar with Steve Harvey. Okay, great. Everybody in the room pretty much. So Steve Harvey has these hoodie awards that he does. And I remember like the first year that they were doing a big hoodie awards coming together. They were the iHeart Music Festival or iHeart Music wanted to sell all these tickets online. And people started calling up to the radio station complaining because they were like, we're not about to go put all of our credit card information online in this online system. We have no customer service line that we have to talk to. So I'm listening to his morning show, and I thought this was way before this study, years ago. And I thought like how interesting it is that like they shifted the whole entire strategy, because Steve Harvey is a man of a particular power and prestige, and got iHeart to shift their entire strategy of how they engage. They opened up a customer service line so that people can call and do orders by phone. This is also pre-pandemic. And so the whole strategy changed because the target were a lot of older black folks who were like, I'm not going online to put all of my information. I don't trust that my information is going to be safe in this particular realm. So I think like that's a really good example of, if you know your audience and the context in which they are living and all of the vulnerabilities and barriers that they are already facing, if you are not tailoring your strategies around that audience, you're simply being irresponsible.
Yeah, I was speaking to my neighbor, and it ties into this piece, which is whether or not people think identity theft actually genuinely helps them if they've been victimized before or if they've never been victimized at all. And 64% of individuals that responded to this particular survey said that identity theft protection helped resolve their ID theft issues within a day or less. So the question was specifically 24 hours or less. And 36% that didn't have protection were able to resolve their identity theft issues in a day or less. I was talking to my neighbor about this because he has 3 kids, and he himself has been victimized by identity theft within his own family as well, which is unfortunately a common anecdote that we are receiving from black individuals. But he said that when his kids reached a certain age, he got identity theft protection for all of them. And the reason that he even thought of doing that, beyond the fact that he was victimized, was because he went to Costco. And Costco, when you're walking out, I don't know if anybody has Costco membership, when you're walking out, they have that panel of stuff, and somebody's definitely going to be there to try to sell you some solar panels. But he had, there was Experian's, I didn't want to name drop them, sorry, but their consumer protection package there. And it was a really interesting way that he kind of played it out, because it was in a space that caters to families, and it was in a space that made him feel like, oh, I can trust Costco, which is also a part of black communities. One, you don't know what you don't know, and number 2, referrals are such a big thing. I am not going to go to somebody that I find in, I have a yellow book, I don't know why that was the thought, on Google that isn't recommended to me by someone in my own family. In phase 1, we found that 92% of individuals, they did think that identity theft protection would keep their family safe. And those that did have identity theft protection experienced less loss, over $500. So James, we're talking about, making sure that programming is equitable. How can the safeguards and best practices of all of the people here today be tailored for not just black communities and individuals, but communities that are disenfranchised in general?
Yeah, everybody here knows this is an increasingly difficult thing to do, to protect identities, for a wide variety of reasons, and most of the identity crime we see today begins with someone's identity information, their personal information being compromised in some way. More often than not from a data breach that becomes the fuel for most of the attacks later, whether they're social engineering or they're just a traditional phishing attack. It's all designed to get people to trust them, so they can get more information, which they can turn around and further victimize that individual. And it may be, this is not a term I'd recommend anybody use, but you'll get the point. It's almost a passive kind of victimization because they're often not even aware it's happening. During the pandemic, when you had people's identities being used to apply for unemployment benefits and open new kind of accounts, bank accounts, to park the money that had been stolen in the benefit scam. So the individuals whose identities were compromised often didn't even know that that had occurred, which is where you kind of get to this repeat victimization statistic, which we see in the general population as well as in the black communities that we have looked at in this study, of the repeat victimization levels are consistently growing. So it's not that you're just hit one time, you're hit multiple times. You may be hit multiple times in the same short period of time. So how do we help those communities? One is, as the defenders, we have to do a better job of defending. We have to keep identity information out of the hands of the people who would misuse it. Step number one. If you don't have the information, and you don't lose control of it, then you can't have someone victimized down the path. That's part number one. Part number two is we have to have programs that help individuals understand there are unique risks that they and they alone have in their community. And part of that may be cultural, part of that may be geographic, part of it may be demographic in terms of age or education. But there are unique elements that we have to help them understand. And that's really what we have to get to next, is designing programs that help people understand that there are people in the world who are helping to keep their information safe, but there are things they have to do too. And then if the bad things do happen, then there are resources to help them to recover their identity.
Yeah, Glenance, this was something that other people were surprised by, but you and I were not surprised by, which was that an overwhelming amount of survey respondents, they told their family and friends, but they did not tell law enforcement. What questions and focus groups did you use to help flesh out the reasons behind that?
Yeah. I mean, part of the question was just understanding the process. What was the process? How did you work to kind of remediate this issue? And so as they started unpacking, then we started teasing out why they went to this particular source. So often folks are going to credit card companies, a bank company, but then some places they go, depending on how egregious the crime is, they have to go to a law enforcement agency and file a police report. In most cases, they have to do that. The challenge then becomes once they go to an LEA, they are often not treated with a lot of respect or believed, you know, especially what we found is when they said that it was somebody that they know, then they feel like that they are also in on the crime, you know, and so that not being taken very seriously. But part of it is just helping to understand, not necessarily, well, you know, we do ask why didn't you go here, but unpacking the process of the steps that they took and allowing that to guide the conversation in a particular direction, so that we don't feel like we're trying to intentionally extract information that they're not necessarily ready to give. And that all has come up organically in every single focus group that we did. You know, here's the process. This is what I did, and this is why I don't want to do that again. Yeah. You know, and a lot of folks felt like they didn't get a lot of resolve going to LEAs. Not to mention, we have the history of, you know, law enforcement agencies and black communities, that all of that is at play as well. But independent of that, they're not a source of resolve for communities. So they leave, but they're still stuck in the same place.
Yeah, and that leads to frequency of victimization. So on the left, you can see that from the ITRC's Consumer Impact Report in 2022, 26% of individuals have been a victim before. 63% of the victims from our study have been a victim more than once. So that's a massive jump from 26% to the 63%. And 26% of victims who responded to this survey reported a loss between $1,000 to $4,999. And that's compared to, if it's going to go, the 9% of ITRC consumer impact report victims that lost that same amount. And to be specific, our general victims that also respond can include white, Hispanic, Black as well, but that's still, even within that 9%, is such a significantly small number within that for Black individuals that come directly for our services. This is my favorite question when I was writing this one out. How did stakeholders on the ground engage in the survey, in the initiative?
Yeah, they were very supportive. A part of it was us wanting them to, we use the same strategy. We're at the Black Researchers Collective, the mission of our organization is to train and equip communities with research tools so that they can be more civically engaged and policy informed. And that doesn't just go for, the end user and community, but also our community partners as well. And so we actually leverage, I'm also a community organizer, we use a fair amount of community organizing strategies for our work. And we know you can't come into any community code saying, this is a thing that I want to do and I'm going to do this and that's it, that's all. A lot of folks do that and you don't really get very far, or you were met with a lot of resistance, because it feels like another violation and disrespect. Mm-hmm. But when you have respect for somebody and you're trying to build a relationship, you say, hey, this is the work that we're doing. Let's learn about the work that you're doing and how there can be some kind of synergy or alignment with the work that you're doing. Then when folks are able to really kind of buy into, because they know that it's important, they have to also see the value in it for themselves. They're likely to have a lot more ownership and accountability over the process. Mm-hmm. So we actually had a lot of support with folks on the ground because they believed in what we were doing. They knew that it was helpful and important, and they also know that nobody has the answers, like all of the answers, right? And everybody's still working through. So if I can be the person in my city to help, do a little bit of something of this, then maybe I can make a difference. And so we found that they were tremendously supportive in that way and likely to help. And we invited them to sit in on the focus groups as well, of course, with the consent of the participants. And they learned a lot, and it was great for them to hear firsthand. They're going to get a report, and they're going to see all the stuff that you all see when that information comes out. But to sit in a room and experience the emotional impact of it, things that necessarily may not always come through in a report, was something that made them be much more encouraged and inspired to be like, I need to do something outside of this. Yeah. We need to figure this out. We need to go get some funding for what's coming down the pike. And so that was really the kind of response that we had. And it wasn't surprising at all. I mean, that's how organizers and mobilizers are able to get things done in community because of those kinds of strategies.
Can I tell a story out of school?
Yeah. And
right now she's panicking, by the way.
No, I want you to tell the story. I also, though, want, after you're done with the story, we need to talk about how HUD surprised us. Yeah.
So we'll talk about the antithesis of HUD first. I won't name the city. But when early conversations about trying to identify groups that we could work with that would give us that relationship that we so desperately needed to make this successful. And we were talking about the topic of, well, what kind of a research are you doing and why are you doing it? So, well, identity crimes and identity theft and victim support. And so who in your municipal government is responsible for that? And the answer basically was, well, we don't have any identity crimes in our community, which is the second largest city in the United States of America. So
we're still not naming them.
So 17, as I remember, was the number. There have been 17 reports to the city of fill in the blank of identity crimes.
In 5 years.
In 5 years. So we knew right then and there, those are people we don't want to talk to. Yeah. And we needed to go out and find other organizations. And that is one of the reasons we are confident we're going to get the information we need to go on to the next phase, which is the development of programs which we hope will be meaningful but more importantly, the people that we're going to help recover their identities, we hope they find them to be meaningful. So,
Well, before you answer that second question, I actually say we do need to be talking to those people. And
we are now.
And the reason why I say, and for you all in the work that you're doing, because that shows you that there is a tremendous gap somewhere, right? And I think what thing that's really helpful with said city and all the other stakeholders that fell through in various cities is it allowed us to be able to say the work that we're doing, it affirmed that work. This is so important. Yeah. This is why it's so necessary. And when it comes out, then we can go back and say, you know, we actually went through every arm that we could possibly. We exhausted all of our resources that you say are here for consumers, but actually are not protecting consumers. Yeah. You know, and here are the ways in which you can protect consumers and hold their feet to the fire, right? Especially when you're getting resources and funding to be doing just that, when you're actually not doing that. So I would say, that I think that they're just as important as the people who are able to sign on board and say, yes, I'm going to own this and let's move forward with it.
Yeah, and our report for this comes out second week of September. I'm not going to say the date because, life happens. But one of the things that we had decided to do was to analyze the conversations we had with all the organizations that we had reached out to. In one city that's along the West Coast that I also won't name, altogether, I think we reached out to 30 organizations, and we had communication with, I think, at least 10 of them. And if you note, we did not name a city in the West Coast that we actually were able to conduct focus groups in. And that's not out of the deep amount of trying. I went to said city and harassed so many people. But it was also that organizations don't always have the capacity to have these conversations. It's not that they don't want to have the conversations or that they don't have people that are affected. It's that they don't know how to have these conversations yet. And that's also caused by the lack of accessible language. So when I've been sitting through a lot of these talks I write on paper, and I can't say that while I look at James because he hates paper. But I've been writing out the ways that we can change certain parts of this language to be accessible to individuals that don't have the same access to digital landscapes the way that you and I do. And that's a really, really tender piece because we started learning that a lot of these organizations receive HUD money. And if you're trying to get housing for individuals, one of the first steps is to look at their credit report. And that is also sometimes, as we've learned, the first point where people actually learn that they've been victimized. And James and I have discussed this a lot about phase 3, which is programming, how to attach ourselves to HUD groups to make sure that we've heard the conversations about making sure that things are integrated and operable across multiple programs. This is one of those spaces. This is a place where every single group that's getting HUD money has to do this. And every single group that is offering services to individuals has to be able to have the conversation with them on a one-to-one level. And it's a really big part of our programming as well. And we talked about this, like how we build out that programming with those groups, but while we're talking about HUD and like more government groups, I kind of want to lead us to the March 2nd fact sheet from President Biden and the strategy that includes the public, private, and nonprofit sectors working together. How, if at all, will this affect Black communities and disenfranchised communities?
Well, it will, but it'll if it is ever implemented, even partially. This is one of those things when anything is better than nothing. If you haven't read it, go back and read it. It was buried as part of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, but there is a specific section, there are 3 points around identity crimes and identity crime victims. It's the programs that they are proposing to pilot, one of which is through login.gov, so it's an identity proofing, identity verification pilot, but also this concept of a one-stop shop, where if an identity crime victim knows or suspects they have been victimized, they could come to a central point, and where you would have both the public sector, all the parties who are represented there, maybe state government agencies, federal government agencies, local agencies, as well as the private sector, who could all be sort of handed off person to person, agency to agency, rather than the individual victim having to figure out what to do. Because that's one of the things that we've learned, particularly in this study, is people don't know where to go. They don't know who can help them. They don't have, to Tiye's point, they don't have the language. They don't know how to describe what has happened to them, and everybody describes it differently. So having this concept of a one-stop shop for identity crime victims could be very, very powerful, along with some of the other things that was proposed in that, which was the ability to turn on and off your identity. We have a credit freeze, why can't you freeze your identity? So if somebody is using your driver's license number as part of a benefit application, you could get a flag. You get an alert saying, is this you? It's just a thumbs up, thumbs down. Yes, it is. No, it's not. That sort of a concept, which was going to, everybody here would know, would be an incredible amount of interoperability challenges from state government to federal government to all those sorts of things, but a very simple concept that could be very powerful. And in particular, where you have communities where basic identity information is either not available because they don't have the source documents, or those documents they've been compromised, maybe by a family member, maybe by a stranger, but it is still this concept of, I don't know how it happened, I don't know what to do, where do I turn? If you can prevent that part from ever happening, and then when they do try to misuse it, you can turn it off before it ever happens, that would be incredibly beneficial in these communities.
This is my last question for both of you, but it's really for you. How can lack of resources impact overall wellness of a community?
Oh, okay.
Well, I whoever wants to go first.
I'll take that one. I think particularly when we see some of the mass kind of events that can happen with identities, and the fact that we see this continuing level of identity crime, we're not making a lot of headway. We're making some things. The tools and the processes we have are better today than they ever have been, but they're kind of keeping us static. If we're not careful, though, if we were to ever backslide, these are the communities that are going to be most impacted, and they're going to be impacted first. People that look like me are going to have all sorts of resources to recover and to tell me when it happens and help me recover if it doesn't. That's not true of everyone. So we have to make sure we're doing things to build the processes and the procedures and make sure the resources are available to help those people who are not in a position to help themselves today.
Yeah. And I think just adding to that, I think if you can provide folks with the tools for them to be able to sustain themselves and build their own ecosystems, then it's kind of like you give a person a fish, they eat for a day. You teach a person a fish, they eat for a lifetime, right? And so not investing in communities and providing the kind of resources that we need to sustain ourselves just continues to keep us perpetuating a similar cycle that doesn't allow us to be able to fully and actively participate in an economic system, an ecosystem that allows us to be able to sustain ourselves and thrive. We're not talking about just survival here. We're talking about sustainability and thriving and creating the kinds of conditions that are most advantageous to us long term, right? And I think that that's something that's so important that we have to understand if we want folks to be fully participating and have viable practices long term. And so that access piece is really important. Those resources are just that important, you know.
So this is you can download the quantitative report with this QR code. It's like 27 pages long, but it's a lot of information. It's a very dense amount of information. And our final report, again, will come out in September. That will also include some suggestions. I feel like it's going to be in the 60-page realm. I'm actually quite excited. I like them to be, lot. Con fuerte, But I'm going to open up to any questions because we have like 2 minutes left. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but yes, please.
Questions.
Oh, no, she's stretching.
Were you stretching, or do you have a question?
Oh, we can hear you.
Oh,
Go ahead and
I'll repeat
project.
it.
Yeah.
This is all really fantastic work, and I'm curious about, some of us in this room are working on technologies that sort of shifts the whole paradigm so that even if you have information about people, you can't pretend to beat them. Right? So to get to the next generation where knowing information isn't the key to being that person, it's having an actual credential that's digitally signed and cryptographically provable. And we've also seen like the limited participation from minority communities in developing these next generation of technologies that are hopefully going to address these challenges at a broad societal scale. So what are you guys doing to engage with the technology communities who are working on this next generation of tools to hopefully eliminate the possibility of identity theft?
So I can answer that from a project management standpoint, which is the next 6 months of my life are dedicated to working with organizations and tech companies to have those conversations. The biggest issue in communities of color in terms of physicality, like if you're in the physical space, is that in terms of density of access, most banks don't have the same amount of physical locations in communities of color, like in those zip codes, as they do in more affluent neighborhoods. And that is the first point of access for a lot of people when it comes to financial, and even in the terms of libraries, technical information on multi-generational scales, which is a little weird because it's 2023. We have incredible technologies like in our hands. So why are there communities that are left behind? And one of the hardest parts about that, and it's actually a question I didn't ask because of time, is how do we shape the information that we're getting back to make sure it's valuable for industry stakeholders? And the biggest thing is that when we're hearing these stories from people, like we didn't even go into some of the anecdotes that we've heard from people, it's a lot of distrust. So the part of it is that while we are putting in equity in the communities, tech companies also need to be putting in the same amount of equity, and it can be in partnership. It works better in partnership. In fact, most of the groups that we've talked to that work with other tech companies, one of our favorites, well, my favorites is Clarify out of Philadelphia. What they did is they work physically in these spaces to help promote financial and identity wellness in communities. They're actually one of a very small niche amount of groups that do that. So it's really just like building the conversation, sharing the data, aggressively sharing what we've learned. But yeah. We got to cut off. I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
We're getting the hook.
Yeah,
But
we're getting the.
let's talk offline, because we're also part of BIC. We're part of FIDO. We're part of a number of the tech coalitions. So we can be that access point.
Can I say one thing before we go? We have to wrap. But I just want to say for the tech folks in the room, and this is my just the executive director of the Black Researchers Collective hat. I want to turn that question back to you all as something for you all to think about as you're leaving. What are tech companies doing to engage with communities, right? I think we have this mindset that if we build it, that they will come. And that is true in many cases. Not in this case, right? Because folks are already being left behind and they will not come to what they do not understand. So I really encourage you all to leverage the positions that you're in to think about more intentionally how you can actually bake your work into the work of community and lean on folks who are out there already doing that work, organizations, not necessarily like mine, but other community-based organizations who can help lead the way. Thank you all for coming.